Thank you for inviting me to be part of this next edition of the SMME Roadshow and talking about tendering and in particular tendering as a process with regards to government contracts. The latter, meaning government, is the biggest procurer of goods and services in the country, and it is imperative for especially emerging as well as established and growing businesses to consider going for government contracts, because at the end of the day, a contract from government is very similar to a contract you would be obtaining in the private sector. And irrespective of where you obtain that contract from through a tender process, from a business point of view, it actually then drives the process towards that ultimate objective called sustainability. Because sustainability of a business is a consequence of cash flow. And cash flow is an effect of contracts. And in order then to say the flow or the hit rate of tenders that turns into contracts, in order to improve or to sustain that, we as businesses or bidders to government tenders, we need to make sure that we're consistent in our own approach towards primarily the demand to comply with the instructions in tendering. And so it is important that when we talk about government tendering as opposed to private sector contracts, is that the former government process in tendering is governed by legislation. And it is legislation that primarily drives the instruction or the prescripts in law, as we call it, that directs government officials as to how to manage or implement the total procurement or the overall tendering process. Now, as it is, when we talk tendering, people's mind can go into one of two directions. That sounds interesting, or people saying we're winning tenders. It's a bit of a slip, sometimes very technical, very legalese. And then the other direction is people would make statements like saying that they would not get involved in tendering because, first and foremost, they don't understand the process, and secondly, it's a process that's manipulated. Now, we have laws that instruct how the process must unfold. So, irrespective of where you find yourself, whether it's in sport, anti-doping laws, people will find ways to manipulate or circumvent the rules of engagement. And that is not only then unique to tendering, where this overall perception is that is a tainted process, meaning to say, when people talk tendering, some people's mind will always go to the aspect of shenanigans, meaning corruption, fraud, bribery, and the like. And what we then assure people who are interested in tendering or who are doing tenders is to focus on the process. Because if you are well informed around the legal prescript of how the process should unfold, then you would have much more confidence to get involved with bidding for government contracts. So that's the first question. The second question would be, why should I not go for government contracts in lieu of that objective to create cash flow that would lead to a sustainable business at the end of the day? So it is obvious, if we don't have contracts, there will be no cash flow. And to come back to this point about the prescripts in law, tendering is in South African, in the government environment or government context, is actually governed by the uber piece of legislation called the Constitution. So there in Chapter 13, Section 217 of the Constitution, we find an instruction to all organs of state, irrespective whether it's local government, whether it is a provincial government, national government, state-owned enterprises, state agencies, or state councils for that matter. Section 217 prescribes that at all times, when an organ of state is to activate or initiate a tender process, it clearly and specifically states that that tender process must at all times be managed in a manner that is fair to everybody, meaning to say that everybody gets an equal chance and equal opportunity to participate in the bidding process. Whether they're well equipped or best equipped to eventually render the contract, that is a separate issue. But for starters, everybody should get a fair chance to enter the bidding process as per the instructions of the Constitution in terms of Section 217. The section also further goes by stating that all tender processes must be equitable, meaning to say that everybody must be treated in an equal manner. For example, that no bidder should be alerted about the technical aspects or specifications of a bid prior to it being advertised to all other potential bidders. So that would be an unfair or inequitable equation for that matter. Just one example. So Section 217, which is the heart of the tendering process in terms of debate as to how it should unfold in reality or in practice, then also says that all tender processes must be transparent. Now, if you go to the Oxford Dictionary, the first, or maybe one of the first synonyms that you will find there for transparency would be the word open. Now, many people, because they're not aware of the prescripts and the instructions and the spirit and the DNA of Section 217, they would not then exercise their constitutional right in tendering. For example, Section 217, by way of interpretation for tendering for government contracts, says, it's not written there, but it says that if a bidder is unhappy with the outcome, the bidder has got a right to either lodge an appeal, an objection, or a dispute, of which the latter three are given as a right in two other pieces of legislation, which we can link to Section 217. But essentially, because Section 217 says that the tender process must be transparent, it means to say in simple terms that a bidder has got right of access to information. So there is another law that we can link to Section 217, which is the Promotion of Access to Information Act, or the PAIA Act in short. The PAIA Act in principle says that any document or a copy thereof held by the state, a citizen, whether that's a natural person or a juristic person like a company would be, any citizen who's been affected by a decision and that decision has been recorded, that aggrieved person has got right of access under the PAIA Act to view as to what transpired prior to the state taking that decision. So there's another law called the Promotion of Administrative of Justice Act, the PAJA Act, which also then allows an unhappy or an aggrieved bidder to approach the court or enter litigation by saying, I challenge the decision. So we have two parts to this issue of transparency, where we say on the one hand, there's a law that says I have right of access to view as to what happened in the process. And then on the other hand, we have the PAJA Act, which says I have a right to challenge a decision. So Section 217 goes further by instructing that all organs of state that enters into a tender process must ensure that the process eventually, or even from the word go, would have to be a competitive process. Now, Section 2.1 doesn't say what I'm going to state now, but by way of interpretation, if it instructs that the process must be competitive, it means to say that a minimum of two bidders must eventually be considered for recommendation or for award of a contract which went through a tender process. So we also know that all laws can't be too rigid in its approach. And specifically, additional legislation was written in relation to this piece of legislation that says all bids must be competitive. We then have regulations, which we'll perhaps cover later on, which then says that if a bid process can't be competitive, and this is very important for potential bidders to understand, then the state has got the right to deviate from this section 217, as well as deviating from all other regulations that insist that a process must be competitive. So, for example, in emergency, or my company has been declared as the sole source of supply. Nobody else has got the amount of units required other than myself, despite the fact that there are many competitors or potential suppliers out there. Or on another day, my company has been declared as the single source of supply. For example, I own a patent on a newly developed product, and nobody else would be able to bid then for that contract because they would not have the product eventually to supply the organ of state with. So we know that when it says it must be competitive, we would then also have to take cognizance as to the aspect that deviation is an allowable process within tendering. Then lastly, in terms of the uber piece of legislation or the departing point for us in terms of having a conversation around the enabling pieces of legislation pertaining to tendering, we need to look at Section 217 says that all tender processes must be cost effective. Now, if we want to pause on this term cost effective for a minute, many bidders are under the impression that when they see cost effectiveness, they think price. So what we alert them to is that price does not necessarily lead to cost effectiveness. Price is only a component of an overall budget. And what we also want to inculcate for those who want to go into tendering is to look at these pieces of legislation and ask yourself just one question every single time. What are the opportunities? Every instruction creates an alternative and an allowance for opportunity. So when we talk about cost effectiveness, so we then ring-fence our thinking and our understanding to say that, oh, they're talking about price, but they're not necessarily talking about price. Whereas we said price is but only a component of a budget, and people think that their price that won the tender is the budget. I'm giving you a big tip here. It is not the budget. The budget also have got a portion which we may call a contingency. Should anything happens in the marketplace, there's a percentage of that budget that is allowed to be added on top of your price which won you the tender. So what are we saying? They're never going to give us the budget when they issue a tender, but take this as a given. Every tender is subject to a budget which was approved in the previous financial year. And if you win a tender on 10 Rand a square meter, rest assured that budget for that tender is probably 13 Rand for that matter. So there's also a nice tip that people should every time apply their mind to and say, how can I perhaps then extract more value from the price that won me the tender in addition to it itself? Then also the legislation and the rules of engagement further instructs government to create a framework. So in that very same section 217 of the Constitution, chapter 13, section 217, subsection 3, it clearly instructs government, national government, to write a framework of tendering. However, subsection 2 of that very same section 217 says that when government draws or designs the framework, it must also give preference to historically disadvantaged individuals. So then our constitution, of which section 217 is part thereof, was finally adopted in 1996. And then in the year 2000, government then responded to the instruction of section 217 in 1996 that then said that government must create a framework of tendering that will give preference or create a bias towards historically disadvantaged individuals. And government then responded in the year 2000 with a law that's called the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, commonly known as the Triple PFA. Now, as it stands, for a bit of information, every act that is promulgated in Parliament must always be followed by regulations, because it is the regulations that gives interpretation and meaning, or life for that matter, to the actual law or the act that was promulgated in Parliament. So in the same year and published in early 2001, National Treasury, whose task or the custodian of procurement legislation for purposes of implementation, then published the first set of the regulations pertaining to the triple PFA. And the Act itself clearly stipulates in Section 2, the Act, not the regulations, the Act clearly stipulates in Section 2 that there will be a point system that must give meaning of interpretation and application to favoring or create a bias for historically disadvantaged individuals that would now enter tendering at that stage, 2001. So essentially, the Act then is very specific and it's very clear that there must be 2-point systems for tendering. One would be an 80-20, of which 80 will be the maximum points allowed or afforded to the person or persons that submits the lowest price. So 80 as a maximum points allocation or entitlement would then go for the lowest and not the highest, the lowest price. Then 20 points remaining that is left would then be given as a maximum to those people who has got the highest percentage in terms of ownership or equity within the bidding company itself. So nowadays that 20 points would be allocated, for example, to a level 1 BE company that's bidding for this contract. So that will be a maximum. And if you're a level 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or a non-compliant for BE purposes, you get less and less proportionally out of 20 points for BE. So that is the first system, point system, which currently is pegged at below 50 million. So all tenders below 50 million rand automatically is governed by the 80-20 point system. 80 as a maximum for the lowest price and 20 as a maximum for the highest BE level of the specific bidders for that matter. Then the opposite to that is we have the 90-10 point system, currently pegged at tenders above 50 million rand. So automatically, the projected value of the tender is going to be in excess of 50 million rand. The state would indicate that the 90-10 point system will be applicable. Same rationale applies, 90 for the lowest price offer and 10 for the highest BE level of consideration or contributor status of the bidders in this specific tender. So essentially what we then say is that every tender must always be governed by a value, a rand value. And that rand value would then give the bidder an idea as to whether their pricing should be above 50 million or their pricing should be below 50 million. Now, from a bidder's point of view, there's two types of bidding activities. One is request for quotations, and then what we call competitive bids. Now, there are two levels of government as well before I come back to the request for quotation and competitive bids in terms of their values. And those values, take note, has got nothing to do with the 90-10 or 80-20 point system pegged in terms of 50 million below or 50 million above. But firstly, on a local government level, procurement or tendering and the implementation of that process is governed by the Municipal Finance Management Act and subsequent supply chain management regulations for local government. So that's a local authority level, which could be a municipality, a water board, a municipal zoo or a municipal museum, or a transport authority like the BRT, you know, the bus rapid transport system, which you see in Durban, Pretoria, Johannesburg, Cape Town, and I think one or two more cities. And those are all run by municipalities, and whatever procurement they would want to institute, they would have to follow the Municipal Finance Management Act and the subsequent supply chain management regulations. So the MFMA, in short, as we call it, governs the tendering process on local authority level. And then for all organs of state above local government, that would now be your provincial government, your national government, your departments, your ministries, your state-owned enterprises, your agencies, and your councils, etc. On that level, we call them PFMA entities. So if your entity is listed in the PFMA, which is, the long title is the Public Finance Management Act. Public Finance Management Act for the PFMA. So both of these two acts, MFMA, Municipal, and PFMA, Public Finance Management Act, then governs the tender process at the respective level. Now, both acts would then instruct that irrespective of which organ it is applicable to that level, PFMA, MFMA, must either procure goods and services through a request for quotation, which on a local government level, which will change within the near future, but for now, it is 200,000 Rand maximum inclusive of taxes. So as part of the tendering process, if the organ of state wants to procure goods on an ad hoc basis, not really so, but on an ad hoc basis, they would then have to go for a request for quotation, and that would be pegged at 200,000 Rand. And for a request for quotation, you would, generally speaking, just need a minimum of 3 formal quotations. Now that is 200,000. On a PFMA level, above local government authority, currently we're sitting at 500,000 Rand pegged Rand value for quotations on a PFMA entity level. And that would change on the 1st of July. It will then shoot or rocks up to 1 million Rand on the 1st of July for PFMA entities. Municipal entities, they also want to increase it, but it has not been approved as yet. So, you now know automatically on a local government level, if an RFQ, which is a bidding activity, must be less than 200,000 Rand inclusive of taxes, then automatically a competitive bid on local authority level must be in excess of 200,000 Rand and any amount thereafter. Whether it's now below 50 million or above 50 million, it is immaterial. A competitive bid on that level, local authority, must be in excess of 200,000 Rand. And in a competitive bid environment, we saw by way of interpretation from the Constitution, Section 217, that the minimum interpretation is 2 competitive, qualified, valid, and responsive bids. We'll talk about those 3 issues later on. Then on a PFMA entity level, it is then without saying that the Rand value for a competitive bid would then have to be in excess of 500,000 Rand as we speak, to be changed to 1 million on the 1st of July 2021. So, but what is also important, what happens after I've submitted my tender? Now, both the PFMA and the MFA prescribes that the whole of the tender process internally with the organ of state must be governed through a committee system. The committee system is sort of controlled or managed by the accounting officer of that organ of state. And it is the accounting officer which then will also appoint the respective members to those committees on a term basis. They're not necessarily getting appointed for one specific tender. They are appointed on a term basis. So, there are 3 different committees within the tendering process as prescribed, remember, by either the MFMA or the PFMA for that matter. So, irrespective which level the organ of state is defined at, the first structure in the tendering process for the committee system is the Bid Specifications Committee. or the BSC in short. The BSC is tasked with approving the actual requirement or the item that will be purchased or the actual service that must be rendered, or if it's construction, we call it works. The actual works, there we don't talk about specifications, but we talk about the scope of the works to be done by the contractor. And so this committee liaises with the supply chain management unit, if they do have one. The supply chain management unit received the requirement or the request from the end user. Now let's just say it is a provincial hospital and they need to buy an X-ray machine. The end user department will then liaise with the supply chain management unit, which will then prepare the specifications for the bid specifications committee that will then, when they're happy, they will sign it off and declare that specifications as the basis on which bidders must respond to in terms of the requirement, meaning the X-ray machine that they want to purchase. So essentially, after the bid specifications committee has done their work, the supply chain management unit officials that works for the state will now design and draft the particular tender document. And that tender document would consist of different parts. As what we will call is the tender data. It is what they want as a requirement, as well as the specifications or the scope of works if it's construction. And it will also sometimes have schedules, attachments, drawings if necessary. But the key part of that tender document will be your tender forms. Now, those who have done tenders would have noticed that the tender forms on the top right-hand corner are always numbered or labeled. So if you do a tender for a PFMA entity, it will then be labeled on the top right-hand corner as SBD, Standard Bid Document Number 1. That's a tender form. And you'll notice, standardly speaking, there are 9 different SBDs. From 1 to 9, different forms demanding different information to be inserted as a tender form by the bidder. Now, if you would do a tender tomorrow for a local authority, the top right-hand corner would identify or label the tender forms as MBD1, Municipal Bid Document Number 1, and it will go as far potentially as MBD9 for that matter. So that is the biggest challenge for those who want to submit tenders for government. If your tender forms, your bid or your bidding forms for that matter, are not totally completed, then your bid will be declared as a non-responsive bid. It will be declared invalid, and it would also be considered as a bid that's not qualified. So now the supply chain unit has issued the tender. We all saw the advertisement, and now we have responded. We completed the forms as per the instructions. Very important. The tender I did last week for a municipality might not have the same instructions I do this week for a PFMA entity. You know, most times we think and we believe that submission of tender is one envelope, but the organ of state could stipulate that you need to respond by way of 2 envelopes. I saw a tender recently that asked for 5 different envelopes. And that is not copies, people. It's not copies. That's a different instruction as to how many copies you must submit. But when they say 2 envelope system, you need to understand which tender forms goes into which envelope. They should guide you, but bear in mind, most tenders with such an instruction of a 2 envelope system does not necessarily guide you as to which tender forms must go into which envelope. If you mix it up and you get it wrong, you will be disqualified. So now the tenders has been received after the closing date at 11 o'clock on the 1st of June. And now the supply chain management unit, the SEM unit, would now look for technically compliant bids. And so they receive 100 tenders, and perhaps only 30 of them are technically compliant, And this 30 is now then handed over to the next committee. So remember, our first committee was the bid specifications committee, and the next committee is the bid evaluation committee. So in most instances, the bid evaluation committee are blind as to their approach of evaluation, not blind in person, but blind as to who you are. They would do a technical evaluation on your offer in lieu of the specifications of the product or the requirement or the scope of works. It's a technical evaluation. So, on another day, when the tender demanded that they need to look at other aspects of your offer, for example, your experience, your technical understanding of the bid, your financial offer in lieu of the requirement, your track record, your professional team, and even references. These are additional elements for evaluation, and they would fall under the framework called functionality. So functionality is a given as per the triple PFA regulations, where an organ of state can then afford you points for those elements which you would notice, which will be listed in the tender. For example, technical bid understanding or your proposal, your financial proposal, your track record, your professional team, and for example, your references. That's what we call functionality. So the bid evaluation committee or the BEC would do one or two things subject to the instruction of the tender document itself. It's either an apples versus apples approach, which is a technical blind evaluation. They don't look as to who you are. And then on another day, a separate, different tender could have the element of the framework called functionality at play. So all of this is guided within the tender document itself. And it's very important that bidders not only need to be informed as to what the instructions are in the tender, but that they also read for interpretation or comprehension in order to respond correctly. Okay? So if the bid says that you must submit 3 reference letters of contracts over this last year, then if you submit 2, obviously you are not compliant. Now, if you submit more than 3, you're still compliant, but it's not going to favor you more than the next person who indeed also just submitted 3 reference letters. The issue with people not responding to the instructions of a tender in most cases is not because they don't understand the instructions. It is because they had no respect for time. They had no respect for the process. If the tender closes at 11, you can't be starting at 9 o'clock. People must move away from this notion that they know prices, they know their work, they know the craftsmanship. That is not tendering. That is delivery of a tender, of a contract. A tender is to be compliant with documentation. Now, what if you start your tender at 9 and close at 11? By 10:30, your previous suppliers has not sent you the reference letters. Then all that investment, time and money, which is unrecoverable resources, has been wasted. Okay, so that is also just a big caution that one could give to those who want to enter the game of tendering. Now, this committee, remember, received 30 different valid bids, and now they've gone through the evaluation process, and then at the end of the day, they create a shortlist. Let's just say 5 out of the 30 has now been placed on a shortlist, and that shortlist is handed over to the third and most important and last committee called Bid Adjudication Committee. The Bid Adjudication Committee is a very powerful committee. It can either accept the recommendations of the previous committee, it may reject the recommendations, and it also may send the list back for review, telling the previous committee, the BEC, to start over again. Or if the BAC, Bid Adjudication Committee, is happy with the recommendations of the BEC, the Bid Evaluation Committee, it may or should then make a recommendation to the accounting officer of the organ of state who issued the tender. And that accounting officer is the only person with delegated authority from the MFMA or the PFMA respectively to then make a final decision as to who should be awarded the contract. And please bear in mind, the bid adjudication committee does not appoint the tender, neither does the bid evaluation committee or the bid specifications committee. The appointment, legally, contractually speaking, is done by the accounting officer. Also, there are lots of rules pertaining to who may serve on the BEC, the BEC, the BSC, apologies, the BEC and the BAC for that matter. For example, a person can serve on the BSC, an official of state, even external advisors is allowed, like architects and quantity surveyors or industry advisors. They're allowed to sit on the BSC, they're outside people. They're also allowed to sit on the BEC. But the same person can sit on both BSC as well as BEC. But none of the people who serve on those two committees may serve on the BAC, Bid Adjudication Committee, because that committee must be an independent outlook in terms of fairness and treating everybody equitably and determine as to whether the process was correctly followed. Okay? So then that will, as I've said, the shortlist will be handed over to the accounting officer that will make a final decision. So, big question. Why is it that our tender gets disqualified? There's only one answer that would have 1 million sub-responses. The one answer is your bid get rejected because it's not compliant. You have not responded by way of compilation to all the instructions. So there is a client of ours that says to his bidding team, the bid administrators, prepare the tender for a judge, not for these committees. Because if the tender does not come our way, we want to convince the judge that that is our tender. But you can say that if you have a full understanding of the tendering instructions within that document. So what are we saying bluntly? Drop your attitude of saying, I'll leave this for tomorrow morning. Invest time and resources that it is well spent. Those who win tenders fairly and squarely are those who are good at responding to the instructions of the tender. So it is essential, in conclusion, that you must understand that tenders demands capacity, it demands quality, and it demands ability. The officials serving on these committees will pick up whether you have the optimal capacity, optimal ability, optimal past track record, and the best professional team or the best people to do the job at the end of the day. So, I can relate to an anecdotal story. I did training once and I asked the people in the room, why are you here? One lady said, I'm here because I'm told that in order to win a tender, I must know somebody on the inside. The next gentleman said, I submitted a tender for the first time. I won it and I don't know how I won it. Which means to say, he did not know anybody on the inside. So that is then a solid counter to disbelieve that all tenders are corrupted, and I would stop there in conclusion. Thank you very much.